extension at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. I was in the College of Natural Resources there, and a big piece of my work there was to, my extension work was to work with lake organizations, watershed organizations, and others, mostly within the water quality, water quantity realm, on collaborative management of natural resources, incorporating social science, and to how county personnel and the DNR and others did their outreach and communication with landowners and groups to try to affect behavior change, essentially, to manage those resources across ownership and administrative boundaries. So that was a kind of a natural switch when I came to the Forest Service, was looking at that interface between private landowners, public stakeholders, and then our land management agencies like the Forest Service and others that are typically involved in cross-boundary collaborative resource management. I'm also part of the Family Forest Research Center, which is out of UMass Amherst and is a partnership with the Forest Service and runs the National Woodland Owner Survey. So not only looking at kind of how cross-boundary work happens, but also how individuals engage in conservation actions on their own lands, whether they're family forest owners or agricultural producers. So that's a little bit about where I've been. When I came to the Forest Service, this was the very first project that I became engaged with. Actually started working a little bit on it before I was even here in February, when I had my very first phone call, and it was very exciting with my new colleagues in that December in 2014, which just seems bizarre that I've been here 4 years already. It seems like yesterday. So what happened was, oh gosh, that's not showing up very well. I'm so glad, John, that Lamper, that I've got you cited here. So you'll see some images in here. I have no GIS whiz at all. I am, speak GIS as maybe a 10th language or something. So I lift a lot of these PDFs out of documents of beautiful maps, such as the one that you'll see here. So there had already been this project and approved by the time that this then the social scientists from the Northern Research Station got involved, where the folks on the Lakewood-Laona District in Wisconsin on the Chequamegon-Nicolet, we're working on this project, had the final environmental impact statement, everything was approved to go forth. And they were cooperating already. There had been some interest with the folks, the ecologists at the Northern Research Station offices in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, to look at some of the ecological aspects of this, which I'll talk about in a second, from the kind of like natural experimental conditions that were laid out. So the entire project area is about 37,000 acres near Lakewood, Wisconsin, and if you look at if you read the environmental impact statement, the needs are focused on forest composition and diversity, stocking levels, and then this thing that I'll talk about a little bit today at Pine Barrens, so the rare and altered communities that have changed over time due to fire suppression. There's some wildlife habitat needs in there, fuel reduction, road management, kind of typical things that you'll see in most of this area of issues that we might have on our forests. If you look at John's lovely map, you'll see that the historical composition, I think this was from the 1871, was 42% jack pine, scrub oak, barrens. That's that kind of lighter green that you see, that neonish green. So there was a pretty dramatic shift in composition over the past century, as we see in many areas. This is the impetus for that. I really enjoyed when I went out for the field site visit for this project, and John took us around different areas, different staff showed us different things, and we saw some of the industrious little undergrads from UWSP and other places working on in the heat of the summer on their data collection, so that was also interesting. But just being out on the landscape and seeing how, and hearing John's essentially environmental interpretation about how things had shifted over time and what the conditions were that the staff there were trying to bring the system back to, was really enlightening. So many of you might be familiar with pine barrens ecosystems. This has been my first real foray into this realm. So other things that are going on, there is the Northern Oconto County Community Wildfire Protection Plan that is comprised of 4 towns that are wholly or partially within the Chequamegon Proclamation boundary. And there is the potential for fires greater than 1,000 acres due to fire suppression, obviously, decreased precipitation as a result of climate change, and then just simple, density of vegetation due to suppression and other factors. So I feel like oftentimes when I'm talking about this, obviously it doesn't apply to this group today, but it's interesting to me how many people don't think of fire as an issue for eastern forests and really relegate it to western forests. And I think that we'll start to see some of those changes over time as people start to become more aware of these things in this region. So here's another beautiful map of the treatments that were being laid out on the specific areas within the project area. So this is just to illustrate the variety of actions that are being taken on that landscape and how that really set up a really nice, Pestigo fire, yes, I actually have that in here. Somebody was talking about the Pestigo fire in the, I think that was, 1871, it was huge. A huge fire in Wisconsin, I think had songs written about it. So canopy openness, forest composition, effects on fuel loading, fire risk. Brian Sturdivant from the Rhinelander office will be studying those factors in relation to these different treatments that are taking place on the landscape. Crystal Kern from Rhinelander will be looking at how vegetation composition, diversity, invasive species, and so forth shift post-treatment for these different treatment combinations. And then Dion Bonner-Wright will be looking at impacts on wildlife, and specifically she's looking at birds, bees, and bats and different pollinators. And then finally, there was this group of social scientists from the Northern Research Station, and then a cooperator, Anna Haynes, and a graduate student, Emily Usher, from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, both in the Center for Land Use Education, who worked on this project and conducted the surveys, or worked with us on the surveys and so forth. So we did 2 surveys. We did one of landowners, one of visitors to different locations on the forest, and then also focus groups looking at how people responded to different scenarios, looking at looking at pictures of restoration practices and landscapes and how they felt about those different, how the visual preferences related to those. And like all of the best laid plans, we were not prepared, the social scientists, for the lag in time between the time that, for instance, a timber sale can be announced and the time it actually happens, and conditions on the landscape and how that impacts treatments and so forth. And so initially we had wanted to look at how people view the landscape with these different practices, whether it was prescribed fire or thinning, clear cut, and so forth, over time. But we didn't have the time to do that. So we're actually doing that now with another cooperator, Ingrid Schneider from the University of Minnesota. And we might have some time at the end to chat a little bit about that piece of it. For this one, we really wanted to look at, and for the webinar today, I'll be talking about specifically acceptability of prescribed fire and how landowners, we're pulling from the landowner survey primarily, feel about prescribed fire being used on the forest and what might predict the level of acceptability that landowners think about prescribed fire and its use on the Chequamegon, and in particular that restoration area. So we know from other research that risk perceptions about fire and about damage to their own property or risks of escaped prescribed fire and so forth can impact how people feel about prescribed fire, and also other forest management practices. So that goes for things also like roads. So as we develop more roads, and how people feel about the risk that there might be increased from increased traffic near their low density residential development and so forth. Perceived efficacy, so how effective people think that treatments and practices will be to achieve outcomes and intended outcomes, in this case as laid out in the environmental impact statement. So all of the practices that we asked about and all of the goals were pulled directly from the FEIS and the report that John Lamperer had developed, and others, I'm assuming, on the forest. Goal alignment, so the extent to which stakeholders, residents, think that the goals that are being focused on by a public land management agency are in line with their own goals, and the extent to which they agree that those are important. So in this case, reducing wildfire risk, restoring the pine barrens, and so forth. Trust, I think we find that this is over and over again over the past decade or so has been one of the most increasingly studied factors in natural resources social science in general. Just the level to which trust and personal relationships can impact how a stakeholder feels about an agency, about the actions that that agency is doing. We know that, for instance, in some places like down here on the Lakewood-Laona National Tallgrass Prairie, there was some research done here about 10 years ago looking at how the surrounding landowners felt about fire and other management activities, and even those who did not want intensive management practices happening at this prairie restoration that was so nearby their neighborhoods, those who had relationships and trusted the Forest Service staff down at Medewan at their office were generally, not conflictive. They still supported those staff and believed that the staff had, the best interests of the ecosystem and the nearby residents at heart, even if the residents themselves didn't agree with the action. So it's a little convoluted, but we do know that that level of trust can really impact how successful or not something is, and therefore that investment in relationships that staff can make can be really important. This just to give a shout out to Paul Gobster, he took some really beautiful pictures of the Moco Barrens in northwest Wisconsin. Anyways, Moco Barrens on his way to his cabin that were really lovely that you'll see throughout this. And so we can see how beautiful of a landscape this will be. We conducted this survey. It was run again through UWSP, and Emily Usher, who was a grad student, did just quite a bit of work balancing all of the input from 5 different PhDs on how they thought a survey should be developed, which isn't an easy job. So if you ever get the chance to talk to Emily, tell her good work. We wanted to understand how landowners felt about landscape restoration practices and the management actions that were needed. As I said, because of those that variety of treatments that were going to happen on the land, as we saw on that map with the little X's that showed where shelter wood were and the different types of cuts and burns that would happen, there was an opportunity then to see how they would react to pretty significant landscape change where you're transitioning from kind of heavy forest cover to more of a barren landscape. And we were really interested in how people experience this, because we hypothesize that it's likely to be a similar to any other kind of major landscape change that might even not be voluntary, right? So if you have a wildfire or flood or anything else that comes through, how that shifts the landscape, people experience basically trauma in response to that, and we wanted to see if those same kinds of things happen in response to planned landscape scale restoration actions. So we'll be looking at that as we go forth over time, looking in this area, talking to these people in 3, 4, 5-year increments to see how they're experiencing these changes, not just from fire, but the other practices also, and as the landscape changes. So the survey was sent to 1,200 landowners that were within a 10-mile radius of the Lakewood Southeast project area. and all of them had property larger than a quarter acre. And this often, when we talk about this project, people often ask us why that was. And it was really strategic because a whole section of questions on the survey is about what people do or are willing to do on their own land as part of a restoration, looking at landscape scale work and shared stewardship. So after the non-deliverable, return to sender envelopes came back, there was 1,169 people who responded. We sent that survey out in 4 waves. It's kind of a typical survey methodology where we sent a postcard announcing the survey, a second wave of the actual survey inviting them to take it, a third wave of a reminder postcard, and then a 4th wave of a replacement questionnaire. This garnered a 43% response rate and 499 people who responded. We also did do a non-response bias check, and it turned out that the people who didn't respond in the first time, so they just got sent a postcard with a couple of questions, and we compared those folks to the ones who did respond to the entire survey, and it turns out that the people who were more critical seem to have responded to the survey. So that's, if we're going to be biased, at least it'll be biased toward the people who, well, I have no idea what's happening. We just got out of a...
Yep.
Yeah,
folks, can you still hear us? I will get it loaded back up, get the talk loaded back up.
Thank you.
Bear with us, folks.
Did I do that somehow?
Possibly.
And any... Sorry if I did. I just moved the mouse to go
No, you're fine.
So I guess, so if you're going to have bias in any case, I prefer, especially when we're making land management decisions or using it to inform potential future actions, that it be biased towards the more critical stakeholders rather than less critical, so that we really do have a more of an accurate picture, I think, of what the extent of disagreement could potentially be. Sorry. Okay, people can still hear. That's great.
Yep. Sorry, folks.
Technology. What can...
All right. It should be loading. Bear with us. The audio is still on, it sounds like. Now we'll just hope we can get the webinar back up.
Well, in the worst case scenario, maybe I could just share my screen and pull it up on my desktop.
Well, we're getting some people typing in saying the visuals are back yet.
Oh, good for you guys. You guys should.
There we go.
All right.
It should
Thanks,
be back
Jack.
now. Sure.
Sorry if I did something to make that happen.
Nope, we're all good.
All
we're
right.
all back. So, thanks, folks.
Excellent. So here we are. I'll very cautiously move my mouse around now to bring us forward. So the survey asked kind of a standard set of questions about sociodemographics, and then a series of questions about forest management goal alignment, and you'll see those specific items in a minute here. The acceptability and effectiveness of different management actions, again, which we'll see, beliefs about restoration outcomes from the project, and I'll talk about a few of those specifically. Trust both in the agency in general in the Forest Service and then local forest staff. And then a couple of sets of questions on communication preferences, so how those surrounding landowners would like to be communicated with, and their perceptions of communication to that point on the part of forest staff with them. These other 3 questions that are in italics are sets of recreation participation on the Chequamegon, and I'll show you just kind of an overview of that, but I'm not going to use it in any models of prescribed fire acceptance. Forest values, again, we asked a couple sets of questions, but they're not in these models, or in this model they'll present today, and then the actions that they're taking on their own land, which is a whole separate kind of research objective that we had with that project. So this is a snapshot of what those 499 respondents said that they do on the forest. This is percentages. So most people, and it's consistent with, I think, national trends with how people value and use natural spaces. Viewing scenery is the thing that most people, or the biggest proportion of people did. Not surprising for Wisconsin in particular, hunting, especially on the Chequamegon, in that area that would be a popular activity. Hiking, wildlife, bird watching, right? These are all kind of the consistent, hiking, wildlife, watching, and viewing scenery are the kind of consistent top three that we see nationally, and in Wisconsin I think that hunting makes a lot of sense. I was a little surprised by the lower percentage of camping, but when you get down and see the makeup of the age classes of people, the ages of the respondents, that might make a little bit more sense in terms of what people are doing on the forest. So this is maybe like my 5th survey that I'd run in Wisconsin, and on every one I tend to see the same breakdown of the age of respondents, and it might be due to the fact that most of the surveys I've done are people who live in more rural areas or on lakeshore properties, places, cabins, things that they might not be able to go when you're younger, that you're working in more urban areas or ex-urban areas, and that you would either have these places as second homes for vacation, or that you might be spending your time there as you retire and so forth. So we see that a huge percentage, I think I can scroll over that, I can't scroll over it for you, but it was nearly 3/4 of the respondents are over the age of 56. So really skewed towards that age group. We have a nice division of the years that people have been on the property. We found in past research that the length of time that people have been in an area will impact their willingness to support different types of management actions, where if they're anticipating a major landscape change from something, that they would be less likely to support it if they've been on that landscape longer. But this is divided about in thirds of people less than 10 years there, all the way up to more than 25 years. About 3/4 of the respondents were male, also pretty typical of the experiences I've had conducting surveys in Wisconsin, where more men respond than women. And a little less than half with at least a 2-year college degree, and several with graduate and advanced degrees too. So here are the management goals that were pulled from the documents, and in line, obviously, within those needs that I went through a little bit earlier. Managing roads, preventing wildfire, fisheries, wildlife habitat, kind of this list over here, and you can see that there's preventing wildfire. That yellow color is very important, and that out of all of the responses had the highest proportion of people saying that that was a very important goal, both to them and the forest. And we have, that's only followed if you combine both the very important and important together, preventing wildfire and managing wildlife habitat are kind of neck and neck there. So 2 really important things to people, and you can see where the other things rank out. Managing roads, there's not quite a few people saying that it's very important compared to some of these other ones. Same thing with habitat reintroduction, species diversity, and so forth. So it's just a little picture of that. Preventing wildfire is an important thing to these landowners. Acceptability of management tools. We see that, again, on that, where 1 is totally unacceptable and 5 is totally acceptable. So the higher these means are that you're seeing, that indicates more agreement or more acceptability or more importance. So the scale is down there at the bottom if you need to look at that again. So we specifically asked about active management, logging, mechanical treatment, and prescribed fires, and there was a little educational kind of paragraph in the survey that talked about the Lakewood Southeast project and the different types of things that were happening, and explained them a bit so people would have something to respond to as they answer these questions. So you'll see here with prescribed fire, you've got a pretty big portion, more than 60% of the people who find it acceptable or totally acceptable, a much smaller proportion who find it not acceptable, and then in the middle here we have this no strong opinion or don't know category, And both with the mechanical treatment and prescribed fires, we have these kind of big proportions, about 20 or so % of people who don't have an opinion about that. And that leaves open a lot of opportunities to be able to take that 20% of the sample and potentially the population, as they're in line with what that sample is thinking, and shift those attitudes to the positive, right, so they find those things acceptable or important and so forth. So that is, this acceptance of prescribed fire is what we're really interested in today. After we asked about the acceptability of those practices, we then asked how effective they were in achieving intended outcomes on the landscape. So you can see there's a whole lot more uncertainty in terms of effectiveness versus acceptance. So people really aren't sure how these work on the landscape and what they achieve compared to how finding them acceptable or not. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between those things, and that makes sense too, because we see there's a time lag, of course, between those, between the actions and the results themselves. We asked people about what they thought about restoration outcomes. Specifically, they were asked whether or not, or the extent to which they thought the Lakewood Southeast project would result in these different outcomes to the landscape. And there's a series of outcomes, again, pulled from the environmental impact statement and the project documents that we used here. And so the first one is restoring the landscape to a pine barrens. So a really general kind of restoration outcome. And you'll see that there's, again, that big piece in the middle, that blue, kind of, you work down from the yellow on top, it's yellow, green, and then blue in the middle, lighter blue. That's all the uncertain people. So there's just a lot of uncertainty for each of these in terms of what they think is going to happen, except if you look down all the way to the end, you see that reduced risk of wildfire. So the two in the middle are risks, kind of negatively stated risks, so that they think that using the restoration activities will result in an escape prescribed fire, and then that restoration activities would cause damage to private property. Those ones, we don't see, we still see that same level of uncertainty. We see a lot of disagreement with damage to private property, and then that reducing risk of wildfire, we see quite a bit of agreement with those statements. So the next question we asked was about this trust in the agency and staff to make proper decisions regarding the use of prescribed fire. And I'm sorry, I think my little boxes with the means and standard deviations were grayed out. So if you want that information, I can email it back out later. Sorry about that. I changed the color of my background. So look at these graphs, and they look almost identical. So it was actually funny today when I was going through and kind of formatting things. I was like, gosh, these graphs are almost identical. And so I had already sent in my presentation to Jack with already an error. So I was not going to go back and say, let me take these out. These are correct. These are how people responded to this question, where they were asked whether the extent to which they agreed that they trusted the staff, their local staff, to make proper decisions regarding prescribed fire, and the agency, Forest Service itself, to make good decisions about use of prescribed fire. So I went and I looked, when you look at the regression model, let's talk a little bit about that when both of these variables were included. Also the level of agreement about communication, so the extent to which the Forest Service provides the public with clear and understandable information, and there was again a set of questions and items about this, and specifically the one I'm talking about today is the use of prescribed fires and how well those are communicated. And you'll see this huge big chunk, about 57% I think it was, of people who think that they have no opinion, so there's no strong opinion about that communication, and they just don't know. So it's a lot of uncertainty, and again, that leaves open a lot of opportunity for us to, or for this local staff to communicate with folks about these different practices in the restoration project in general, so that they can help shift those attitudes and shape them so that they are positive. So here is the results of a model and regression model. So we'll see, it doesn't come across so well right now, but you'll see there's a few bolded ones. They're the ones that actually have something in the T and P column for the t-test and the p-value. And these are the ones that we see we hypothesized for each of those a positive relationship and impact on the, I'm going to get my little arrow. So we forgot I had that. So we hypothesized this positive relationship in how the level of acceptance of prescribed fire from how people felt about these outcomes. So we found that this, the belief that it will result in a restored pine barrens, that those activities would, that was positively related to whether or not, or the level to which people accepted the use of prescribed fire on the forest for this project. The next one is this prescribed fire effectiveness. So remember, we talked a little bit about how there's more uncertainty with effectiveness versus acceptance, acceptability of that, of prescribed fire. And we see here that it was positively related to acceptance. And then going down a little bit, this is where it was a little bit funny when I stopped to really examine those those graphs. And I was like, oh gosh, these look identical. So we had both trust in the agency to use prescribed fire and then trust in local staff to use prescribed fire on the forest. They were, when I saw those graphs and I reran my model and did some checking, even though they weren't, there wasn't high multicollinearity between those, they weren't really, overly correlated. When I looked at just the bivariate correlation, just the extent to which those two things were correlated with each other, it was really high, 0.76. So really, it seems to me, and I need to do a little bit more investigating, probably not at 11:30 on the day that I'm giving the presentation, but a little bit more investigating about the extent to which these are the same thing. It might be that people in that area really are thinking about the local staff as the agency and vice versa, and therefore both of those aren't necessary in a model. And we found in other places that they are completely separate things, and people, like on the Medewan example, where people really liked their local staff and might have had a little bit more mistrust in the U.S. Forest Service itself. And then finally, our last one is this college degree. So I actually just compared the people with any type of college degree to those without a college degree. And this was significant. It was a significant predictor of acceptance, and that's pretty standard. We often find that the higher levels of education are correlated with more acceptance of restoration projects in general, not necessarily the practices that we need to take to get there. This one was a little bit surprising to me that it was not significant, the years owned, and so we didn't see any of those relationships that I've seen in similar surveys in Wisconsin. And then these other outcomes that are related to risks. So the resulting in an escape prescribed fire, property damage, none of those things were highly related to acceptance. So what's really exciting here for a social scientist is that those four things, the belief that the project's going to result in a restored restored pine barrens. So the more that people agreed with that, the greater they accepted the prescribed fire and the use of prescribed fire, the greater the extent to which they believed it was effective, the more they accepted it, and the trust and college degree. Those four things alone explained 64% of the variance in the in acceptance of prescribed fire. And it is rare for social scientists to be able to see that level of explanatory power from our models, especially ones with only 4 variables. So it was really exciting. When we first ran these last summer to go to a conference, I couldn't believe it. So it's really helpful to see that from an applied standpoint, that the more that we can talk to people about how effective prescribed fire is in achieving landscape restoration outcomes or kind of general outcomes that they're interested in, and the more that we build trust with individuals, the more acceptable our management practices like prescribed fire are. So that's a really, I think, helpful And I guess I'll hear what you guys have to think about that. But to me, it's a really helpful thing to think about having some simple lessons and simple approaches to maybe shifting attitudes and having people accept prescribed fire and its use on the landscape. So the respondents to the survey were rather homogeneous. They were, mostly male, mostly older, and we had a kind of even split between the length of time that people were there and the amount of time they spent on their property. We also asked about that, how long they spent on how many months. So there was a lot of similarity in the respondents and quite a few of them. As we went through earlier, prescribed fire generally was acceptable as a management tool for this restoration project. There was 60% of the people who agreed or strongly agreed that it was acceptable. We had a kind of big chunk too who were uncertain. And again, those four things, it was the beliefs about restoration outcomes were much more important than risk, in the perception that they were at risk either from an escaped prescribed fire or personal property damage from any of the practices. Beliefs about the effectiveness of the practice itself, so yeah, believing it works, that results in people agreeing that it should be used. That's consistent with other research that we've seen on restoration of oak ecosystems here in the Chicagoland area. Trust in the agency and or staff we talked about, and then education were all related. So it's a few things that can be focused on for communication and outreach with stakeholders in that area. So the other thing is that we have this no strong opinion, and I mentioned this a few times as I was going through, but people had no strong opinion or didn't know answer that with regard to many of the survey statements. And when people aren't dug in, you might see this in your own life. I tend to dig in. If I have an opinion about something and I tell my husband and then he disagrees with me, I feel that much more strongly how right I am. I don't know if this happens in any of your lives. Maybe it's just me. But when we have an opinion, we tend to, if we're challenged on it or presented with information that might negate our opinion, we oftentimes dig in further and our opinion becomes much more solidified and much more strong. So when we see the no strong opinions or don't knows, like we saw in this survey with regard to quite a few questions, that is an exciting opportunity. It means there's people out there who don't have a strong opinion yet, and we can therefore have this chance to shift what they're thinking in a positive direction through various communications and social marketing means, so that when they when they want to dig in, that they're going to dig in a way that is in line with what we know about ecology and forest management. So there's a lot of opportunities there for that. We do want to do a much more in-depth study of treatment preferences based on those visual impacts of the treatments, and in particular the time since treatment. So as the landscape changes 5, 10, I believe 20 years down the road, and I can't sing the praises of the staff on the Chequamegon-Nicolet and the folks working in the Rhinelander office for helping us develop the visualizations for this second phase of the research that we're doing, which is to look at how different treatments by themselves or in combination with each other and along with no changes in the landscape are viewed by residents and people and visitors in the area. So it's been a really helpful thing to have this big group of knowledgeable folks who know a lot about forest ecology, who know a lot about wildlife, who know a lot about all of these different conditions that we're trying to experimentally alter in these visualizations so that survey respondents can look at each one and kind of choose which ones they find preferential and for what reason, and that will give us a lot of information to use. So I see a couple of questions on there. I'm sorry I haven't been paying attention to that chat. I do want to say thank you to all of the, with the 3 J's was how I remembered them. It was John, Jeff, and Jay who worked on the Lakewood-Laona District and helped us quite a bit in the beginning and throughout with a lot of the work that we've done, the focus group participants, survey respondents obviously, and then all of the folks at the Rhinelander office who helped. So was ethnicity included at all in cultural use in addition to the others such as recreation? So we have a whole set of questions on forest values And a lot of those, we had I think there's about 21 items, and we looked at cultural uses of the forest, including consumptive and subsistence, hunting and fishing, using the forest for science, using the forest for spiritual and traditional reasons. Many of those were included. I can't remember if we asked ethnicity on the final survey, but if you wait one, I think I've got it open still on my computer because I was using it, and I will just look for it really quick and answer that if I can find it. And it's not open, but I will get that and let you know later on, if that's okay. We'll respond to that. The response rate was pretty good. It actually was. So we, one of the things that we found in Wisconsin, at least, that has been bumping up our response rates out of the 30s into the 40s without using incentives heavily are offering the survey both online and as a paper copy. Offering things like you can call us and we'll fill it out with you over the phone. And that has worked in a couple of surveys I've done to about 8% of people take advantage of those, 8 to 10% of people take advantage of those opportunities. Partnering with ruffed grouse hunters to boost acceptance. So we see, I think that actually the Ruffed Grouse Society has some of these early successional forest projects. We're working with them or they're working on in other areas like the Monongahela National Forest, Ohio, the Wayne National Forest, and I think there's that project in the Lake Superior Landscape Scale Restoration Project. And I don't know if they are doing any work or if they're involved as partners in this restoration project. One of the things that's different about this project in particular compared to how some of the other projects that I'm working on that are landscape scale restoration projects is that there's not a huge component here of cross land ownership boundary work. And so what I've seen, or the other projects that I'm engaged with, it seems like Ruffed Grouse or Trout Unlimited or whoever these kind of hook and bullet NGOs, they're really working on the private landowners, getting the private landowners to do things. But I see endless opportunities at any time for non-governmental organizations to help promote good land management activities with people who will listen to them. So if they have a captive audience, whether it's their members or people who just kind of are in line with the objectives of their organization, they tend to have a big impact. Ducks Unlimited, all of these groups have really helped, I think, conservation missions with and kind of bigger landscape restoration projects. Will supplemental data be available? So we have all of the survey data, and it would be, I think, all of our data that we collect from the Forest Service, any kind of public entity, as long as we remove personally identifiable information, can be shared, and I'd be happy to share anything. We have a full report from this that's online, and when I went to go, I was going to put up the link for it in the presentation, and when I went to go pull it, I realized that last March I had sent a revised copy of it, which had a different title page because there was a typo on it, and they hadn't shifted it out yet, and so I didn't want to share that again. I will send the PDF to Jack, who can then send to everyone, and you can see all of the kind of descriptive statistics from both the visitor and the landowner survey. And then if you want anything in particular, you can email me and I'd be happy to share with you or answer questions as needed. So,
yeah. That's a good point. So I will make sure once I have that document from Kristin, I can get that up on our archived webpage. And that webpage will also have the recordings of the presentation and a PDF presentation and any other documentation that Kristin wants to send me. If you scroll to the top of the chat box, you'll see that archive page URL that you can use.
So Todd is saying we do work with the Ruffed Grouse Society on the district. Are you working with I may have misunderstood that question because it was in, thinking of it in the context of some of these other projects where they're big partners. Are they doing landowner outreach and kind of landowner engagement across property ownership on this project?
You're asking Todd that, correct?
I'm asking Todd. I'm watching the chat box intently to look for a response.
And he typed it in. Yes, he doesn't know.
Oh, you see something already? Oh, it's nope. I don't see anything yet. There it is. I see. Oh, I just see your. I don't know if they do. Okay, yeah, I see. Did the paper copy of the survey include? Yes, we always include that self-addressed stamped envelope. So we basically follow the Dillman et al. Total survey design that they've been recycling every 2 years into a new book, so you have to spend another $20. But it's the same old thing of, yep, send the announcement, then the survey with a self-addressed stamped envelope on both the second and, so the first time you send the survey, you send it, and then again when you send it again, when you replace the survey for the non-respondents. There's a lot of limitations on how we can spend money. So of course, when you're, the university got funding for the survey itself, and we paid the grad student, but they also had government funding, and then couldn't use, you can't send people $2 in the mail, which we did on an invasive plant species, family forest owner survey in Indiana, and it really bumped our response rate there. We had like 65% response. So if you can do the self-addressed stamped envelope and $2, an actual $2 bill, it really helped.
Boost that response rate.
What's that?
They said it really boosts the response rate then.
Yes, it was great.
Good. We have a few more people typing, so let's see if there's additional questions coming in. While we're waiting, I guess I'm interested to see if there's going to be additional surveys like this, either in this location or other parts of the state. Go ahead and answer these questions first. One from Jay.
I don't see any of them yet, so I think there's a little bit more of a lag for me. So while I wait for those to come up, I will say, so we are going to do that survey. It will go out in January after the holidays. Will be that visual preferences, looking at what the different potential short and long-term landscape, how it might look as a result of these practices, restoration practices. So we'll have that in the spring, and that same kind of gradient of restoration practices from just from thinning all the way up to clear cut and drastic landscape change. So we're really excited to see those responses. I still don't see questions in there, Jack. So you wanna?
Yeah, there's not really a question. Jay just typed in. He said, when doing landscape level projects, we have to be careful not to focus on one species such as rough grouse. So just a comment.
Oh, that's helpful.
And then Yari responded saying that the $2 bill trick works well. And Mark Horn has responded, Rough Grouse Society very active in Douglas County, both in public and private land. So I am waiting to see if there's any additional questions. Any other thoughts, Kristin, while we're waiting to see if there is questions?
No, I guess I'd be really interested if people, who are working on these types of projects, if they think that those, variables we talked about essentially, that the belief in the effectiveness, the support in the larger, outcomes or belief in the outcomes of the project themselves. Are you seeing that on the ground? Just a kind of a little bit of ground truthing of the data, if that's an accurate, depiction of reality. Whether or not you can put that in the chat box now, or maybe email me separately, or give me any thoughts. I'm really interested in some of these perceptions, because some of it was surprising to me, coming from kind of a collaborative watershed and shoreline management, agricultural landscape management, looking at conservation practices and best management practices on ag land. This is a really new area of research for me, and I find it really interesting. And I unlike the other areas and topics I've investigated in the past and worked with through extension and outreach with farmers and things, I don't actually have a whole huge a lot of experience in my past chunks of years working on this. So I'm interested in knowing from others whether it seems to have the ring of truth to it or not.
Okay. I put Kristin's email address right up there, plus that is on our webpage also, on the archived webinar webpage. There's contact information, so if people want to contact you directly, they have the email there. Adam just asked, how much does this type of survey cost to implement? Just a ballpark figure.
So the survey itself, I think, was about $6,000, and that doesn't include the cost of the grad students who worked on it. So if you include, if you're just talking, printing, stamps, all of that kind of stuff, it's, they can run from $4,000 to $6,000. If you start thinking about all the time to develop it, and if you had to pay somebody for that, entering data and then analyzing it, obviously it's a lot more expensive.
Okay. Christy asked, do you ever use these surveys to learn about what methods of engagement people prefer?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I only asked a whole set of questions on this survey about preferred engagement methods too. And those are, we have that survey report that we'll send out that has all that information for people to see and people on the district to be able to use as they desire. We also use it in other surveys to actually design the outreach methods. So in the projects that really depend on family forest owners, for example, to start doing actions on their own land, we will do surveys before projects start. So we're about to do this on a landscape in southeast Ohio that's within the Wayne National Forest counties with all those private landowners to actually develop messages so that we can basically use marketing techniques to try to get them engaged with in oak conservation actions on their lands.
Excellent. And then John just typed in that the results of the work have been very helpful to folks in the Forest Service there, and some of the results really help focus on certain groups of the public.
Oh, good.
Folks read the rest of that, and I don't know if you have that yet, Kristin. There might be a little time lag for some people to receive the chat messages. But again, just said very, very useful research. Thank you, Kristin and team.
Thank you.
All right, let's make sure, folks, if you're getting questions, go ahead and type them in. And while I'm waiting to see if we have any additional questions, I'm going to go ahead and just get to the last slide here, just to announce the January webinar, excuse me. Right now it's scheduled for January 17th. Every year we fund a number of intern projects. It's kind of a research management team. And we're funding these proposals, and we funded 2 last year, one on seasonal burning to improve management for brush-independent species. That was a study that was done in Minnesota. And then effects fire restoration in pine woodlands on culturally important species, low bush and velvet leaf blueberry, which was done in Wisconsin. And those will be, both those webinars will be on the same day, about an hour time slot, so figure 15-20 minutes for webinar. And right now it's scheduled for January 17th, which is the heads up to everybody, is potentially that webinar date may have to change. So if so, you will get notification through the general emails that we send out and a change on the website. All right, let's go back to the questions here. Ben asked, is there a plan to follow up the survey after a few more years of treatment?
Yes, that is our plan. So our plan is to go back into the area every 4 or 5 years so we can look at, as changes are happening, how people are responding to it. Because we don't have a whole lot of information about long-term landscape scale changes or landscape changes in general and how that changes over time. We, whether it's intended changes from a restoration project or it's a disaster, we tend to ask people right afterwards how they feel about things, and then, give that information out to whoever it's useful, and then, it's done. And there's not been a lot of follow-up. So we're really interested in how this changes over time, because I think as, when we go into an area, so we buy a cabin somewhere or a house somewhere, we bought it because we like the way it looks right now, right? And we might experience a change, a drastic change as a shock, and then eventually it grows on us, and then we love it, and then or not, we don't know. But the newcomers to the landscape, then we would expect them, they're buying there and they're living there because they like the restored landscape and it's the way it looks now. And so we want to look at some of those differences and be able to see how people and restoration and the landscape actually interact with each other, people interact with it, and how that changes over time. So yes, I'm really excited for that.
Yeah, that'll be a really interesting comparison too, important. And it kind of feeds back into John's early comment about some of the fire crew there, FMO and so on, where they reached out to folks at property adjacent to the Aaron's work and invited them out, on burn day, gave them play-to-play, but that really boosts the credibility and trust of staff. So it'll be interesting to see as additional management work is done with prescribed fire or others, if there can be kind of that connection, at least with adjacent landowners, how that might improve your response, I guess, to the survey too.
That's excellent. Those kinds of things. I know that early on in that first year they did some small meetings with people. I can't remember if it actually ended up taking place in somebody's garage or if they moved it somewhere else, but it was landowners who wanted answers from the staff, and the staff has had this real nice two-way open communication with all the landowners there I think that has contributed to that trust that we saw, and that trust impacts how acceptable these practices are to people. So it's those personal relationships that can make or break a project in a lot of instances.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, we'll give it just another short time here to see if there's any additional questions. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and start wrapping this up. While I'm waiting to see if there's other questions. And again, I want to really thank you, Kristin, and everyone online for joining us this afternoon. Excellent webinar. There will be a recording and, again, PDF of the presentation plus whatever Kristin can send me with survey information, and I'll get that all up on the webpage. And I announced the January webinar. And also just like put out a plug that Kristin has agreed to be one of our speakers at a workshop that we're setting up. It's in Michigan, February 5th and 6th. And it's actually our 5th annual workshop. We call it the Burning Issues Workshop. And one of the topics we're focusing on is looking at kind of social and cultural acceptance. So we'll have Kristin speaking in person there. And it doesn't look like we have any additional questions. So again, Kristin, thank you so much, and thanks everybody online for joining us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, folks.